Larry Rosin is my guest today on the RedTech briefing. Larry is president of Edison Research. You've been going since the early 90s, but you're so famous for one particular study, the Infinite Dial, which you've been doing for multiple decades. It's an incredible study. It has, over time, trended what's happening, particularly in radio in the US. And that's the reason RedTech Briefing had to have a conversation with you. Thank you again for saying yes.
Of course, happy to do it, Omar. I would a little bit correct what you said in terms of we're trending really the entire world of audio in that study, especially as it moves into the digital realm, yes, which was sort of the source of it, but absolutely radio as well.
Brilliant. So since you've been studying the market for 3 decades, and probably the only one who has access, maybe, well, Nielsen has access to data as well, but you've been doing this particular infinite dial studies. Can you give the people who are watching this a 3-minute tour of what you've observed in those multiple decades that you've been doing the study, particularly homing on the watershed moments?
Yeah, well, so we've been tracking usage of audio, acquisition of devices, and many other things. And again, this is a study in the US. It's actually expanded to other countries as well that we've been doing now for 5 or 6 years in certain cases. But in the US, where we've been tracking this data all the way back annually since 1998, we early on, it was, internet radio, people streaming the signals of radio stations and whether or not people were doing that. If you go back to the earliest years, most people didn't even have internet access. So we had really small numbers of people ever listening to any kind of audio online, whether it's radio or anything else. So the advent of broadband, which we started tracking, but it was a dial-up world largely when we started this study. So broadband was, I think, a key driver. Once we started to be able to look, we don't even have to do this, of course, anymore, but we could look at people who had broadband and see that their behavior started to really change in a much more accelerated fashion. And then the biggest thing by far, though, was the advent of the smartphone. That combination of mobile access with internet access and people having this device with them at all times. What really started to move the numbers rapidly was as people got smartphones, they started using apps that enabled audio consumption, whether it be, again, listening to the signals of radio or the streams of radio stations, but much, much more listening to audio products that were native, if you will, to the digital environment. Here in the United States, Pandora was really the early driver. And then, of course, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, and a variety of other competitors came into the space. So I would say broadband first, smartphone by far the biggest change agent. And then some of these, some of the biggest companies in the world really committing to audio are the 3 biggest things that have probably happened over those decades.
So let's focus on that big one, as you said, the giant among those 3, which was the arrival of the smartphone, and then the app environment, that ecosystem, which led to so many more competitors to audio. There've always been competitors, but now these were very powerfully focused on, the same content. It wasn't television taking space or attention away. It was audio taking space on demand, taking away from linear. Would you say that when you first saw how the numbers were shifting and the way people were behaving once they had smartphones in their hand, you could see that there was a problem for radio coming?
Oh, yeah, without doubt. If you looked at the data in the early period, a huge player here is iHeart Radio / iHeart Media. And, they used their bullhorn very effectively to promote use of the iHeart Radio app. And they generated hundreds of millions of downloads of that app, amazing numbers. But they didn't generate that much usage of the app. And that was some of the stuff that we were tracking. And I really think in many ways they accidentally promoted mostly Pandora in the early era. I mean, they weren't promoting Pandora, but they got people comfortable with the idea that your phone was a medium for audio consumption as opposed to the radio, the device called the radio. And so I think they moved people to their phone. And then once they got there, frankly, Pandora certainly at the time was just a better product, designed for the phone, and just a smoother experience. And then, here in the United States, commercial radio tends to play an awful lot of ads, 14, 15, 16 minutes an hour, sometimes even more. And Pandora was extremely clean and introduced people here to the idea that once you're on the phone, you can make it interactive. You can make it create on-demand elements. You can skip songs, things that you can't do with radio. So it repositioned a linear content stream as sort of old-fashioned, and I think that's persisted to this day.
You use the word awful amount of ads. I guess you use that word by choice because it becomes an awful experience. Do you think that was the primary motivator? I know that's the way radio owners, radio stations stay alive. But do you think that was the primary motivator for the switch that kept happening? That too many ads, not enough of what I want, or was it something else?
I think it was a combination of all those things. I think, again, experientially, a lot of these apps were just better than any of the apps. Radio doesn't do a great job here of speaking with a single voice. I mean, what might have happened, we'll never know if it would have mattered, but our individual markets are the way people understand radio. If an app had, instead of just having the iHeart stations here and the back then Entercom stations there, CBS stations, all on different apps, if they could have come together and created the New York radio app that sort of simulated the radio dial as people understood it, maybe, and again, we'll never know, but maybe that would have been more effective than all these different companies having their different approaches and things of that nature. So
sorry to interrupt the thought, but that's the idea of the radio player that happened in the UK, right?
Right.
That aggregation.
Right. And I think a United States radio player would have been extremely challenging. I mean, individual radio players for every market may have worked. And again, we'll never know, or may have worked better at the very least. But certainly iHeart, to their credit, really was incredibly aggressive. And their goal, they wanted to do it, but own it. And the other owners were just not going to put up with that. The idea that their competitor would be the gateway, the gator, the individually gates access to their streams. And so while iHeart tried really to be the radio player of the entire American radio industry, it just wasn't realistic that people would hand over that level of power to iHeart. A cooperative situation like exists in so many other countries with a radio player type technology just couldn't, the structure of the American radio industry just was not going to allow that to happen.
Yeah, but even with that move, had it happened, if radio stations in their streams were going to persist with 15 to 16 minutes of advertising, surely it just couldn't compete with an ad-free experience. Right.
Well, or low ad. I mean, Pandora's ad supported, but much lower. Also, usually a different standard for what the ad sounded like. So a lot of the more, I would say in your face, but whatever the audio equivalent, deeply in your ear kinds of audio ads, right. The prototypical screaming car dealer kind of approach was not allowed by them. So it was really a different experience on many, many levels. One of the biggest mega trends over the last more recent years, but it's a mega trend, is people showing the willingness to pay money to eliminate ads from their environment. Something that most people thought, me included to some level, was really unrealistic, that people would fork over money. But over time, I've come to the realization that, much of America is quite well to do, and to pay $5 a month or $9 a month or something to get all this content and eliminate the ads, what compared to zero wasn't that big a deal. And there was a lot of value created. So now we have a sizable number of Americans paying either for Sirius XM, which is satellite radio, which is not likely to exist anytime soon outside of North America, or to Spotify or Pandora Premium or Apple Music, Amazon Music, et cetera, and eliminating ads entirely from their audio experience.
So satellite radio obviously predates the arrival of the smartphone and the big broadband explosion. The numbers that migrated there, I mean, a lot of it's attributed to the big Howard Stern move that happened, but it wasn't considered a serious threat, even though because it was subscription, there was a payment gateway, it was ad-free as a result. I mean, it wasn't considered a serious threat in the way that smartphones and broadband and what that's heralded.
Yeah, and it is a threat. I mean, it's definitely stealing listening from radio. I mean, it's radio. If you ever come to North America and get a rental car and listen to some Sirius XM, you'll see it's radio in every possible way. The consumer doesn't think about, oh, it doesn't come from a terrestrial tower. It comes from a satellite dish. It's just radio.
Yes.
To clarify a little point, the music channels are all ad-free. The spoken word channels do have ads. Okay. But the thing is, it just keeps chipping away. It's got a relatively low price point, but the car industry turns over very slowly. Only maybe 5% of people per year will acquire a new car, and only a percentage of them will the satellite dish be built into the car. In most cases, it is now. And then only a percentage of them will choose to pay the money and use the product. So, but every year, more people subscribe. Their numbers always go up. It's now in the many tens of millions. And those people tend to use the product a lot. I mean, if you're getting value if you're going to pay for it, it means you're getting value from it. Yeah. And if you're getting value from it, you're using it. And so, but it's this slow incremental thing as that people get new cars that have the receivers easily baked into them, et cetera. And there's quite good loyalty. The churn is relatively low, and it's a very effective product. And it shows that if you can create audio value, people will pay a nominal amount of money, and even $10 a month or $12 a month, which SiriusXM might get for different packages, is cheap enough that the value is there and people like it and keep paying it. And there was a lot of people who thought they would really suffer with the pandemic, but people did not cancel their subscriptions in anything close to the numbers that people suspected might happen. So it shows that people are pretty loyal to it. And when they're in their car, they like having it.
You talked about that incrementalism that works perhaps in favor of FM radio. The fact that people change their car slowly, it's not a rapid uptake. Is that also going to be helpful in terms of preserving radio's role in the car? And for how long? Because remember, the other thing that's happening right now is that every new vehicle you buy is completely able to have, broadband.
Apple CarPlay or Google.
Exactly. And so you can listen to Spotify all day if you want, or any other service that you want, which and the dashboard has been considered, or radio owners have always considered that sort of sacrosanct. That's really the savior. So how much longer will that last?
So it's a mixed story. I mean, we do a lot of research about this. We do a different study called Share of Ear, where we look at all audio consumption. And if you zoom in on that study in the car, broadcast radio still is by far the strongest in the car as compared to at home or at work, where audio consumption has transitioned much more rapidly to digital options or other things. So radio remains really strong in the car, but it's slowly trending down there as well for the reasons you just said. A bunch of things we've looked at, and some of the reasons that radio continues to be strong in the car, it's kind of geared for that. I think I think it's almost linked in people's brains. They associate being in the car with listening to the radio. Even in the world of Apple CarPlay or Android Auto or these other options, it's still the easiest thing for most people. They have a lifetime of habituation of listening to the radio in the car. And I stumbled on a piece of data, it's not ours, that there's a lot of data about the length of the average commute. And here in the United States, it's like 23 to 25 minutes each way for work. But then I found a data point about the length of the average just car ride. So if you average all, including commutes or just driving to the grocery store or dropping the kids off somewhere or all the rides, period, the average length is only 9 minutes for the average drive, because there's lots of really short drives in there. And so for a lot of people, the radio is easy. It turns on to whatever station you are on when you turn the car off. It just comes on. You know how to change the station very easily if you don't like what you hear. And if the ride is relatively short, it's just not worth the effort for a lot of people to hook in their phone or to make their way to a podcast or Spotify or whatever. So it's changing, but it's changing very, very slowly. And I think that's some of the reasons. And again, a lot of radio content, at least here in North America, is sort of designed with people in their cars in mind, sort of becoming self-perpetuating. The more the percentage of all listening is in the car, the more it gets linked with in-car behaviors. So the car remains the most important location for AM/FM listening. That's why it took such a hit with the pandemic and people just getting in their cars so much less. But it is also facing newfound competition, often powerful competition, as well as these technological challenges. I mean, I rented a car recently and I got to the radio and I literally could not figure out how to change the station. I just couldn't figure it out. And I was in a different city where I didn't know the dial. You could type in the dial position. I didn't have any idea, was it 97.3 or whatever. And, I had to pull over the car and just keep fiddling about until I kept turning on the fan. I said, well, this has to be the dial. And it just kept blowing air into my face because it was not the radio tuner. So things have gotten more and more complex. But most people still prefer the radio in the car. They're sort of linked. It's what you expect when you're there.
But you quite rightly said there's a bit of friction currently associated with getting the podcast you want. But that's, as you said, quite rightly, changing. Anybody working on the Apple CarPlay or Google or whatever it is, and the streaming services know about this friction, and they're going to do whatever it takes to change that. And they have bigger balance sheets, and I'm sure increasingly greater lobbying power and relationships with the motor vehicle industry. When you think, and this is difficult, I know, but since you've been doing these studies, I can't think of a better person to ask about this. Are there parts of the industry as we know it right now that won't exist 10 years from now, or be a shadow of itself, be really anemic?
Well, when I think about that, and again, we have data to show this is already happening. Music radio is declining in usage here in the United States at a much faster pace than speech-based or spoken word radio. So the stations that are talk-based or news-based or personality-based, they're all declining. The listening to radio is declining across the board, but those stations are declining at a far slower pace. Those who are providing content that is not easily accessible in so many other places, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, Pandora, et cetera, et cetera. And so I am, I would say somewhere between concerned and full on bearish about music radio as we know it today, with 14 to 16 minutes of commercials per hour, et cetera. Also here in the United States, in smaller markets, there's very, very little or increasingly less local content. It's being piped in various formulations from other places, so that the stuff between the records that supposedly makes radio special is not as vibrant as it once was. So there's stuff that might keep you listening to music radio because the glue inside it created value for you. That's increasingly diminishing, and so it's hard to create a bullish proposition for music radio, again, especially when it's not filled with compelling presenters in between the songs, et cetera. So I believe that sooner or later, American radio and probably worldwide radio is going to, what we saw, music used to be on the AM band here in the United States decades and decades ago, and then FM came along. And AM radio really had to figure out what to do next. And it was, it filled up with spoken word options, the conservative talk station, the all news station, especially sports talk is a real victory for AM radio. And that's largely migrated to FM in a lot of cities. even religious content and other sorts of spoken word stuff. And I think that almost is inevitable for the FM band here in the United States and probably in other territories around the world. Radio can provide really unique content and has and does. But music is no longer something that, radio really had a monopoly on. It's like trucking music to the, they could get music at the warehouse, put it on their trucks and bring it to the customers. And they really kind of had it all to themselves. And other than purchasing CDs or what have you. And that monopoly is completely broken now. And for a lot of people, there's just a better way to access their music. So if you're not providing value beyond or separate from the music, I struggle to see a long-term future for that.
Yeah, but you're saying part of this extinction level event that's looming is the fault of radio owners because of how they've behaved towards their medium, focused purely on cost and less on value to the audiences. That's what you're saying.
Well, that's been a big part of American radio for
sure.
years. I mean, you can trace everything back to a, for good or for bad, a decision in 1996. There was a Communications Act. It was called the Cable Bill. It was really about cable television, but sort of inserted in there by lobbyists was a blowing up of the ownership restrictions, and all of a sudden radio companies could own lots and lots of radio stations. And that got the bankers excited because they saw the possibility of rolling up an industry. And they rolled up an industry, 1996 to 2000 was just the perfect storm. So after that bill passed, the economy was incredibly strong. This new thing called the internet came along that just seemed so exciting. The stock market went through the roof. And so they drew these spreadsheets that included, 15 to 20% growth per year, which is what radio was seeing in those years to the end of time. And you could really get a lot of leverage if you really believed you were going to see 15 to 20% annual growth. And so they used a lot of leverage, consolidated the industry. And then the dot bomb happened in 2000. Radio revenues really leveled off. And so the spreadsheet required this. The reality was this. And they had no choice but to start to cut. And so instead of all this investment, which was the big sales point of all this consolidation, it was just about what can we use consolidation to cut costs. And it's largely been the case ever since. And the NAB just published, definitely affected by the pandemic, but radio revenues are now lower on a nominal basis. Forget with inflation fit in there. It's even worse, but they're lower than they were in 2005 and on a nominal basis. They just filed something with the government to that point. It's the kind of data point that's normally not so easy to access. And so when you're in an industry with declining revenues and lots of leverage, so what profits you have, and the profits are still enormous. That's the thing. The margins are still margins that any other company would kill for.
Yeah.
But the overwhelming majority of the pie goes to service your debt as opposed to be reinvested in the company.
And the pie is shrinking. That's the point you're making, right?
Yep.
So we said it's self-generated extinction in a sense, like we talk about global climate change. We're the cause of it, the cause of our end. Radio owners are the cause of their end. You said there might be a possibility to pull back, but surely once behavior changes among consumers and people discover that something is a better product that suits their needs, we always said this, when they want it, etc. That whole cliche. Why go back, even if they change the way they do things now?
I tend to agree. I mean, I think on demand is the single most powerful media change in our lifetimes, right? Yeah. I mean, it used to be you turned on the TV to see what was there or the radio. And it was like a river that was flowing by, and you just sort of stuck your cup in to see what water was available to drink at that moment. But once the water went past, it was gone. Or at least that cup of water was gone. And we were used to it, and it's just, we didn't even think twice about it, right? You just turn on the TV and watch what's on, see what the best thing on is. And people our age, that's what we did, right? We just said, hey, what's on right now?
Or appointment viewing, right? We've got to be in front of the TV at 10 o'clock.
Right. Seinfeld's on, and I can't miss it. And if you miss it, you've missed it, right? I mean, maybe they'll rerun it in the summer, but that's it. Once you can disconnect all that kind of behavior, you can hear the song you want to hear on demand, listen to the show you want to hear, listen to the podcast you want to hear. Certainly in video, we're seeing that too, in even more dramatic terms. There's very little evidence of people sort of innovating backwards. I mean, sure, there's like vinyl is having this little, moment, almost these nostalgia plays and things like that. But I don't think people are going to get nostalgic for just sort of taking whatever the programmers were giving them at any given point. I think people really, really like being able to watch things on demand, being able to pause things if they're interrupted or they need to use the bathroom or whatever reason they want to pause it. I'm just deeply skeptical that people will backwards innovate from on demand. So while radio companies are creating great content every day, often which just gets lost, right? It just rushes by in that river, never to be seen again. Mm. On demand creates great opportunities for broadcasters, but it just requires a total rethink of what they're doing.
And is that where you think the best companies will go, or do you think they're just waiting for a big check from someone? So you talk about iHeart, and no question, iHeart has innovated in some areas, perhaps not at the local content level sufficiently to provide, your local radio station. They haven't done that, but in other areas they have. Certainly on the innovation and technology side. Do you think they're waiting for a big check, or will they be the ones that transition effectively and profitably and sustainably?
That's a really tough question. I mean, so iHeart has absolutely innovated, and they've invested deeply in podcasting, which is growing. They've tried to compete with Spotify and Pandora and others in terms of streaming with some results, but limited. I would agree with you. Locally, other than offering the streams of local radio stations, they really have not innovated down to that level. And that is a level that probably is out there for someone to attack. Local remains one of these big, seemingly open things, but no one can make the numbers work effectively, at least so far. Even though, like, the New York metropolitan market is by itself bigger than many countries in Europe in terms of population. I don't really know in terms of what any of these companies' outplays are. I'm sure in their dreams, Apple or Amazon or Facebook or Google or even Netflix, says, oh, there's all this content and we can acquire it, and there's all this value from these radio stations which still have enormous reach, and we'll just buy it. We'll offer a number for them that the stockholders and the debt holders all love, and make it their problem. That's certainly possible. It is certainly possible. There were rumors for years, which have sort of cooled down a bit, but maybe they'll spark back up of SiriusXM purchasing iHeart or maybe another radio company. So I don't think it's out of the question that American radio companies get acquired by a FANG company or a large, more tech play. And again, you're much better served talking to someone from Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley about the possibilities of something like that happening than me. But I don't know that they should rest all their plans on finding a buyer. I mean, it's certainly possible. I mean, there's a lot of value there still. I mean, there's massive, even if they're diminished, there's massive reach. And, in a world where so many people are purchasing their way out of being exposed to ads, whether they're using Netflix or they're, using audio sources that don't have ads. When you do have a large ad-based audience, that should create more and more value. It's a supply-demand problem, and advertisers are having a harder and harder time finding audiences. And radio still, big commercial radio here in the United States still commands a lot of audience. And so there's a lot of value there. I mean, you can absolutely paint the argument for why someone might want to acquire one of these companies. But they all have a lot of debt. And so you'd have to really see a vision to take the current amount of cash flow they create, pay off the debt, and still make it work.
Tough question. Off the top of your head, what was TSL like in the 1980s and 90s, and what is it now?
Yeah, it's dropped. I mean, we don't have consistent measurement here. It was Arbitron for years, and then Nielsen acquired Arbitron. So it was, if you go back, the peak year for radio listening in the United States was 1980, and started dropping slowly from 1980, and dropped and dropped, and it was dropping at a sort of steady, slow rate, and then into the 20th century, and then Arbitron, and then after that Nielsen did a measurement change to the meter. So it was diary based, and then they changed to meters here, and the meters from the jump showed significantly less listening than the diaries did for a variety of legit reasons. And they were probably more accurate, maybe not perfect, but more accurate in many ways. And then even since measurement began, the electronic measurement began with meters in 2011, 2012, et cetera, listening has dropped steadily since then. And then, with the pandemic, listening dropped very, very dramatically. And while there are initially like over 40%, and it has recovered about half of that back so far. And now it's sort of stable and is likely to start dropping again. So, when the history is written, I think they'll look at, the 2020 and into 2021 as a real pivot point where listening dropped quite a lot. And especially among younger people, just hasn't really recovered. But I don't want your viewers to miss the point that there's still a ton of listening. I mean, radio still has huge reach, and lots of hours of listening being generated, massive numbers of hours of listening being generated. It's just down from what it was. And it, like I said, is recovered from the absolute bottom of like full lockdown of spring of 2020, but it's well below where it was in, say, 2019. And I think the recovery period is kind of over. Maybe there will be a little spike if life truly returns to normal. But I'm very skeptical that life will return to normal or 2019 normal ever, because things have been so thoroughly disrupted for so long that I just don't see 2019 coming back. And so radio listening of 2019 isn't coming back either, at least here in the United States, probably everywhere.
Well, whether we like it or not, there's a lot of food for thought about how perhaps things have been mismanaged when it comes to radio in the US for long enough. And then other factors, significantly triggered change, behavioral change. When people had no options, it didn't matter what you threw at them, how many ads you put into an hour. You had to keep listening, but not anymore.
Right.
And so, it has hurt.
That's something I've really, now as an old guy who's been doing this for a long time, you can really see with, something that was said in discussion sessions or whatever, where are they going to go? Was it a constant comment, and that question has been answered. There used to be a legit point, we could sort of manipulate things or even be slightly abusive to our audiences because they truly had nowhere to go. If you were the only country station in town, the country fans were kind of stuck. And you could say, you didn't want to abuse it, but you could kind of say, where are they going to go? People will find a place to go now. And so you have to dig in and fight for listeners everywhere you can these days.
Slight pivot away from the US market, because we've heard a lot about it and very thorough. So thank you for that. It's really been not just a history lesson, but a lesson at future history, potentially. Are there markets in the world, because you do studies in other markets as well, where you are seeing a bucking of the trend of what you see in the US? Because you mentioned earlier that potentially every market's heading the way you see the US heading. But when you do these studies, you're probably getting points of data that might surprise you. And I didn't expect that. Is that happening somewhere? And is there a lesson to be learned by the US market from what you're seeing in whichever that market is? Or maybe There's no surprise.
Right. So, of course, there's competitive pressure everywhere. And since radio kind of had it all pretty much everywhere, it has to go down. So it's all about the paces at which it goes down. We've had infinite dial now for I think 5 or 6 years in Australia, and Australia is really a tremendous radio market. The radio companies there are really strong. They're not up to their eyeballs in debt such that they can't do the things they need to do. There's a couple of things that really make Australia different from the United States. One is the fact that there's far fewer radio stations in their cities. And that might seem paradoxical, with so many radio stations across the band here in the United States, you would think, oh, everyone can find something they like. But in fact, maybe it's a paradox of choice kind of thing. But, dozens of mediocre options are just not as potent as a smaller number of really, really fantastic radio stations. That's certainly what my perception is from working deeply in the Australia market now for a number of years. The next big difference, and this is true really across the world, separate from the United States, is here in the United States, they do not pay for the rights to play music. It's a long-standing, goes back to the 1930s, quirk of the American radio industry that it's considered promotional value, so they don't pay for music. And so when you're making programming decisions, you could pay for expensive talent or speech-based content, which is expensive to produce, or you can play music for free. So it's part of the reason that the industry has just generated billions and billions and billions of profits over the years, is if your content is free and you can leverage it and amortize it, it's an amazing business. Here in the United States, the very thing that's made it so profitable is the thing that might kill it in the end, is that since they don't pay for music, all they want to do is play free music and not develop the things I was talking about earlier that could make them more sustainable into the future. Australia is the opposite. Australia has developed talent. They have banks of people whose whole job is to go to improv comedy clubs and college campuses and identify talent at young stages, develop that talent, teach them how to do great radio, help them develop new ideas for radio that no one's ever thought about before. Some of the biggest stars, not just in Australia, but in many countries, the biggest media stars in these countries are often developed on the radio. They often travel off to TV and things like that, but they're often just radio stars, which is really, for a lot of reasons, just not common here in the United States at all. I definitely see Australia as a particularly strong market. Again, fewer, stronger players that aren't loaded up with debt, and a real commitment to talent development and creating vital radio that people want to listen to. I think is well positioned to compete with, by comparison, sort of boring all music services. All that said, though, no one should be blind to the fact that nothing is stopping. Apple has played around in the radio game a little bit with Beats One and things like that. Nothing is stopping these tech players from integrating, and they're slowly doing it, integrating more and more non-musical content into their mix and creating something that's really radio-esque or radio-like, and not just moving music across.
Yeah.
So no one should assume that, people may look back at 2021 as the good old days, as things get more and more competitive.
Interesting, powerful, insightful, fascinating. It's been a great, how long has it been? Over 30 minutes. And that's not usually how long we go with our briefings, but there was just no way to stop you because it was just compelling and fascinating. And that's what radio should be.
Well, thank you.
Those people who are fascinating, who can keep you entertained for a 9-hour drive. You remember that old trope from way back when? If you can have a 5 or 6 or 7-hour drive in a car with someone who just keeps you entertained all the way through, you don't notice how many miles you've traveled. That's the radio star that you want, or that's the person you want on your radio station. Larry Rosin, thank you for these insights. Thank you for the studies that you do, because they obviously really do provide a harbinger of what's to come. They're telling the owners, the shareholders, the managers, what the problem is, so hopefully they can think about how to solve it. But whether they do it or not, that's up to them. It's been a great conversation. Really appreciate having you here.
Good to see you, Omar.
Cheers, Larry.
Take care.